Good evening, and thank you for joining us. I am Sylvia McGee, and I serve as president of the Macon, Georgia chapter of the Links Incorporated. The Links is an international service organization of women who, through its members and 5 program facets, seek to enrich local communities and improve the quality of life for those we serve. We are in an election season. Choosing leaders who take the time to understand the issues and public policies that affect you and the community that you live in is critical. Therefore, voting is critical. Voting represents your voice and your power. This evening, through our National Trends and Services facet, under the leadership of Dr. Wanda West, we want to educate our community about restoring voting rights to those who lost them through conviction. There are many myths and misunderstandings circulating, and you deserve to have the facts and to understand the process of restoration. The members of the Links Incorporated value collaborative partnerships because it is in working together that we make a true impact in the community. Therefore, I'd like to acknowledge and express our appreciation to the partners who have contributed today in order to bring this program to fruition. We say thanks to Central Georgia Technical College, especially its adult education department, Georgia Justice Project, the New Georgia Project, and the Georgia Association of Black Women Attorneys. Now, to moderate our program, Restoring Voters' Rights, Tamika Daniel, Managing Attorney of the Macon Regional Office of Georgia Legal Services, and a member of the National and Services Trend Facet, as well as the Macon chapter of the Links Incorporated, will be with us today to guide us through this. Tamika, thank you, and to panel members, thank you. And now I hand the baton to our moderator. Tamika?
Thank you so much for that introduction. Our chapters are empowered to raise the voices and transform the communities in which we work. Good evening. I am Tamika Daniel, and it's my pleasure to be with you this evening. We have some dynamic panelists that are going to share with you some information that I hope that you will find helpful. We are going to hold all of our questions until the end of the presentation. As you think of a question, though, go ahead and type it in and we will get to it at the end. So now I would like to introduce our wonderful speakers for today. We have Ann Calleton, who serves as the Policy and Outreach Coordinator for the Georgia Justice Project. Next, we will have Billy Michael Honor Jr., who is the Director of Faith and Civic Engagement Organizing with the New Georgia Project. Then last, but certainly not least, we will have Attorney Amber T. Jones, who serves as the Vice President for the Middle Georgia chapter of the Georgia Association of Black Women Attorneys. I would like to welcome all of you and thank you so much for joining us this evening. So let's jump right into our presentation. Ann, I'll turn it over to you. Let's talk about dispelling the myths when it comes to voting.
All right, thank you. I think my presentation is now showing. So thank you for having me. As Tamika said, I'm Ann Calleton. I'm with the Georgia Justice Project, and we do a lot of presentations around the state for people with criminal records who are trying to move on with their lives. And we always include voting because as President McGee mentioned, voting is critical to having a voice in your future. And voter suppression is real. And a lot of people have criminal records in Georgia. 4.3 million Georgians have a criminal record. And so it's an often overlooked group of potential voters and often are confused and don't know their rights. So I appreciate any opportunity to share that with anyone. So I just want to share a little bit of information just about the Georgia Justice Project in case you're not familiar with our work. We're based in Atlanta, and so some of our work is Atlanta based, but much of our work is statewide. So we are a criminal defense organization. Historically, we represent people with pending criminal cases in Fulton and DeKalb counties. And some other work related to that. We are kind of like a private public defender in the sense that we represent people who cannot afford a private attorney, but we have a holistic model where every person is paired with not just a lawyer, but also a social worker, and we have long-term relationships with people. So if our client ends up going to prison or anything, we stick with them and visit them and bring their family to visit them throughout the whole term of their incarceration, and then when they're released, work with them to reestablish their lives on the outside. Clients of ours from 33 years ago when we were founded are still part of our family and come back for our Christmas parties and back to school events and everything in between. And so through those long-term relationships, we got into the reentry lawyering because we saw all the barriers that people faced after they were released. Even though their sentence was done, it was not done. And they have a lot of barriers that they face in terms of reestablishing their lives. And so that's how we got into record clearing work, helping people remove those barriers to employment and housing. Other things that people face is child support debt, not being able to get your driver's license back, occupational licensing, housing with a criminal record is not easy to find. We host expungement summits around the state, including several in Macon last year. And we do, as I said, a lot of presentations and materials. So on our policy work, which is what I do mostly, last year we were fortunate to pass an expungement bill, which expanded what can come off of someone's record. It used to be only non-convictions, but now there is an opportunity to remove some misdemeanor convictions and some pardoned felony convictions as well. So that was a big victory. More work to be done there for sure. We're expanding our policy goals this year to include probation, which I'll illustrate why that is so important later, and some of the other things that you see on the screen: driver's license, child support, occupational licensing. But so the focus tonight, though, however, is voting rights. So this is a picture of why it is so needed to expand voting rights. So I know it's way too small on the screen, but those are all the 50 states. Georgia is the very top line there. And so the blue is the prison rate and the parole rate is in, I think, green, but the red line is probation. Okay, so if you can't even see the details, but you can just tell by how out of whack Georgia is with the rest of the country that we have way too many people on probation in Georgia and way too many people on probation for way too long. So Reverend Billy Honor will talk about that, the implications of that when it comes to voting rights later. But so there's 223,000 people who are disenfranchised because they're on felony probation and parole right now, including the other, I think, 50,000 or so who are incarcerated for a felony conviction. But but the good news is what I can focus on tonight is those who are eligible to vote. So there's about 500,000 people who have already completed their felony sentence and are eligible to vote now, but often don't know that they're eligible and don't know that they have that right. And so I will explain some of that, and hopefully you can help me spread the word so that people are able to cast their ballots. So the most common misconception in Georgia is that if you have a felony conviction that you can never vote again. So that is true in some states. So here is a map. I just wanted to show why there is a lot of confusion. So these are all the states with different voting rights. Every state has their own laws. So, you know, in the news lately is Florida, right? So they have a different set of laws than we do. And so that's some of the confusion, because some places you lose your right to vote forever. Some places you never lose your right. But so in Georgia, I will talk about who is eligible to vote. The good news, right? So in Georgia, anyone who is not currently serving a sentence for a felony conviction can vote now. So, and I'd say, I don't just say felony sentence, I say a sentence for a felony conviction, because conviction is a very important distinction. Because if you're serving a first offender sentence or a conditional discharge sentence and it hasn't been revoked, you can still vote. Even if you're in prison or on probation, if you're under first offender conditional discharge that hasn't been revoked, that's not considered a conviction, so you can vote right now. If someone is in jail and they haven't been convicted of a felony, they can vote. So if you have a pending criminal felony case, but you haven't been sentenced or convicted yet, you can vote. If you're in jail on a misdemeanor sentence, you can still vote. And any misdemeanor sentence, whether it's probation, incarceration, that has no impact at all on voting rights. So anyone in that situation can also vote. So if you have had a felony conviction and you've been on probation and parole, as soon as that probation and parole term is completed, then you can re-register and vote. So voting rights are automatically restored, but you generally have been taken off of the voter rolls when you have a felony conviction. And so you do have to re-register to get back on the voter rolls. And just to clarify, you do not need your record expunged to be able to vote. You don't need to be pardoned to be able to vote. And you're not supposed to need any documentation to be able to re-register, but it's usually very helpful, and I'll explain that in just a minute. So, and another question that comes up a lot is, well, what about fines and fees? Because somebody may have finished the time portion of their probation or parole, but still have some outstanding fines that they weren't able to pay, or fees or restitution. And so the Secretary of State's office just put out some guidance, which on the one hand is very helpful, on the other hand is still a little confusing. So I will explain what we understand and hopefully it will make sense. So it says, if you've completed any term of incarceration, probation, or parole and paid all fines, that's when your voter eligibility has been restored, and paid all fines unless such fines are canceled upon completion of your term of incarceration, probation, or parole, such as when the fines were imposed as a, quote, condition of probation, then they're automatically canceled upon the completion of probation. And then it goes on to say your felony sentence is considered completed even if you have outstanding monetary obligations other than fines, such as unpaid restitution, fees, costs, and surcharges. So the distinction of what is a fine and which fines have been canceled and all of that, to be honest, even our defense lawyers who've been looking at sentencing sheets for decades, that's a little confusing to them. And so on the one hand, they do specify restitution, fees, costs, and surcharges. Fines, to be honest, it's really impossible to tell for anybody to know which fines have been paid and which haven't. So what we are telling everyone is that if your sentence is complete and DCS, the Department of Community Supervision, says that your probation sentence, your parole sentence is complete, then you are eligible to vote. So, and the way to do that, as I said, you aren't required to have documentation, but it can certainly help facilitate getting re-registered. So we tell people to go to their probation office or any DCS office, Department of Community Supervision office that is near them, and request a certificate of sentence completion. And if you go to our website there, gjp.org/voting, and scroll down a little bit, there's about 4 hyperlinks. And one is a frequently asked question sheet that outlines everything I just went over. Another one is about the certificate of sentence completion. And on there is actually like the internal policy number from DCS that will tell you that this is what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to issue these if someone asks. And then there's actually a sample copy of the certificate of sentence completion. And so we recommend if somebody is in that situation, they're trying to prove that they're off paper so that they can register, print those 2 things out and bring them to the voter registry or to the DCS office and say, look, this is what I need. It says you do it here and here's what I need, and go for that. So, the other thing I should say is one person that I talked to this week had been off paper for like 20 years, and DCS was not even DCS. It didn't exist yet. Probation was still a part of the Department of Corrections. And so she didn't know where to go, what to do. And so I said, you're probably not even in their database, because it was sort of pre-computer days when they may not have even had a record of you in a computer. And so I said, just bring any documentation you had from your time on probation, and, you know, any ID, and have them look you up. And if they can't print a certificate because you're not in their computer system, because it was so long ago, just have them write a letter that says she's not on probation anymore, she should be eligible to vote. And that, I think, worked for her. And then another person said that she was trying to get a certificate, and for some reason she couldn't, but she did have an order from the judge saying her probation had been terminated, and she took that to the registration office, and that worked for her to get registered as well. So whatever documentation you can get can certainly help. So here are some helpful links. If you like videos rather than reading a fact sheet, we have a 90-second video, and I can put these in the chat box as well. If you're trying to help someone who's in jail register, that is not impossible. They actually have blank pre-addressed postage paid registration forms that you could mail to someone. Some jails are actually facilitating that for people. Some are not, but it can't hurt to try. The difficulty with that, I should just say, if you're helping someone who's in jail, if you've never been registered to vote before, you do have to show your ID at some point, either when you register or when you vote. So if someone is going to still be in jail when it comes time to vote, someone has to provide either a copy of their ID or a copy of some kind of proof of residency, like a utility bill or lease or something like that, proving that. And so it probably, because when you're going to jail, all that stuff is confiscated. And so probably a family or friend on the outside will have to help provide that information to help with your registration. So that is my presentation. And I look forward to hearing what others share about reducing the barriers and disenfranchisement in Georgia. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne, for that very important and informative presentation. And remember, if you all have any questions for Anne, please go ahead and type them in, and we will address them at the end of the presentation. Up next, we have Mr. Billy Michael Honor Jr. joining us. Welcome.
Hello, how are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. We're glad to have you. Can you tell us a little bit about the New Georgia Project and what message you have for our audience today?
Absolutely. Well, I'm really glad to be with you, and thank you, Anne, for an excellent presentation and setting us up here for what we need to talk about today. But the New Georgia Project is a civic engagement and civil rights organization based primarily here in Georgia. It's several years old. We work in communities that are defined as the new American majority communities. That's African Americans, Latinos, Asians, Amerindian, Native American folks, women and children. It's called the new American majority because people may not know this, but Georgia will become the first state in the South to have a non-white majority by 2024. That actually helps people understand what's happening around the voting rights fight here in our state, and why Georgia's become ground zero for that fight is because of the major demographic shifts and its political implications. Well, we work in the communities who are part of that rising majority to make sure that they're politically empowered, not from a partisan standpoint, but from a standpoint that they're able to express the things that are important to them in their communities through the civic process. And so we do that in a number of ways. Obviously, fighting for voting rights is one of them, because voting is still one of the primary tools in the freedom fighting civic toolbox, as I like to say. It's not the only tool, but it's still one of the most important tools. And so we fight for voting rights, as well as dealing in issues that traditionally have been called criminal legal reform, but I like to refer to as ending mass incarceration. And so those are the two primary things that I organize around. And then the organization as a whole has some many issue items that we organize. And we've registered over 400,000 people in Georgia alone to vote over the last several years. So that's a bit about what we do.
If there are some young people watching now and they're wondering, well, why should I vote? My vote's not going to make a difference anyway. What would you say to someone in that situation?
Well, I understand there's lots of reasons to be cynical about the political process in our country. I'm not going to be a hypocrite about that. I want to acknowledge that. At the same time, we live in a democratic republic, which means that when we want things done in our communities, we don't take a all hands raised vote and then whatever is plus 50% wins. That's not how it works. We actually elect people to take those votes for us, to represent us. And so the best way that we can have a say in how our communities are structured, and the best way to actually have power in the process, is that we take part in the voting process and saying that these are the people that we want to represent us. And so I always tell people, as long as we live in a democratic republic, you better vote unless you want people telling you what to do in your life and how you want your life to be lived, how much comes out of your check, what streets get fixed and don't, how much it costs for your electricity. I could go on and on. If any of those things matter to you, then the best way you have an impact on that is through your vote about the people who you elect. And so make decisions for yourself, participate in the process.
What can community groups like the Links Incorporated do in our community to help further this process?
You can do things like you're doing right now. I think right now, having these public conversations, these public forums are so important. What we lack oftentimes is proper civic education around issues. We often talk about voting before we talk about people being knowledgeable about the process, what the issues are. You should identify your issues before you identify your candidates, right? And so part of what you're doing right now is important. The other thing that civic organizations can do is you can connect the community to the organizing that's happening around the state. I think that's so important. The former president of Morehouse College, Dr. Robert Michael Franklin, in his book Crisis to the Village, talks about anchor institutions in particularly like African American communities. So you have Black families, you have Black fraternities and sororities, and then you have Black schools, and then you have Black churches in many cases. These are the institutions that have grounded a lot of the civic activity among African American communities. And so what I think organizations like yours can do is connect just the masses of people that you are in contact with on a daily basis to issues that matter, right? Using your networks to do that. And so I think you're doing that today, and we appreciate you.
One final question for you. I'm curious to know your opinion on what role do you think that the church plays in this process? What power, or do you feel that the church has any power in this arena?
Absolutely. I mean, the primary thing that I do is organize faith communities, churches for sure, but also mosques, synagogues, and temples, because we know we have a broad religious community among African American people. We aren't monolithic in that regard, but certainly churches play the largest role because of the how many folks name the name of Jesus Christ as Lord among African American people, and because of that, churches have always, not just now, but always played a central role in the movement for the affirmation of Black lives, but not just Black lives, but for the movement for justice and the sustaining and the defending of democracy. And I think what primarily congregations can do is they can make sure that their people have the access to the best information around civic engagement, around the issues that are important in their community. Once this pandemic has ceased, we can go back to being more of a meeting space in the community for people to gather and hear important conversations about issues that matter. We can continue to use digital means that we have learned through this pandemic about how it is we can touch broader audiences outside of our congregations around issues that matter. The other things that congregations can do is they can organize their people for change. And what I mean by that is that, when we want to build buildings and when we got projects we want to do, we'll organize the people, right? But we need to take some of those same skills that we use to build buildings and to get the other things that we want to do in churches, and we need to use those skills to create changes around healthcare, to create changes around how it is we get more people access to public services, and how it is that we get people re-enfranchised, that is, people with felony records, their rights back, which is part of what this conversation is about today. So congregations can do that.
Wow. You said a mouthful, Billy. And we really appreciate your honesty and your candor. We've seen the churches doing the voter registration drives, and we hope that, we'll continue to have those types of movements and being able to offer rides to the polls. But we just really appreciate you telling us how to become politically empowered and to use that power to make change within our community. Thank you so much for sharing with us this evening. If you have questions for Billy, make sure you include those in the chat as well. Up next, we have Attorney Jones. Thank you again for joining us. Can you tell us a little bit about your organization and help us understand what we can do if we face obstacles while we're trying to vote?
Absolutely. I want to thank the Links of Macon, Georgia for inviting me to talk on this topic. Again, my name is Amber Jones, and I'm the Regional Vice President for GABWA. And if you're not familiar with GABWA, we are the Georgia Association of Black Women Attorneys. So GABWA is a voluntary bar association, and we galvanize the power of Black women attorneys. We advocate for women, and we empower our communities. Some of the things that we focus on are issues with women and children. We want to increase Black female representation in public offices and in the judiciary, and we want to take a proactive stance on political issues like this forum today. So the topic that I was asked to speak on was, what should you do if you're told you cannot vote on election day at your polling precinct? There's a few things that you can do that are very simple, and then there's a couple things you have to do after that that might be a little bit more complex. So if you'll be patient with me, I'll walk you through the whole process. So if you show up and your name's not showing up and you show your license, the first thing you're going to do is ask for a provisional ballot. Later in the presentation, I'll tell you more about how that process works. Other options that you have, you can ask for candidate monitors. So some candidates in your county, state, or federal candidates might have poll watchers. And those monitors are there to take note and take your name and make sure that it's recorded, because that's as good as it is for them, it's good for you. And there's also poll monitors that will be there that are just there because they have signed up and gone through the training, and they're there to make sure that, everything is equal and justice is served. And the final thing you should do to protect yourself and make sure that your provisional ballot and that your name wasn't registered at your polling place is called the Election Protection Hotline. And as you can see, it's a very simple number. It's 166 Our Vote. That is the one that the ACLU of Georgia recommends that we use. There are several other hotlines. All of them are effective, and what that'll do is keep a record that you come to vote, you ask for a provisional ballot, if you got one or didn't get one, and how to proceed forward. So what is a provisional ballot? It allows you to cast your ballot in person, even if all the requirements for doing so can't be met at the time. That means that your ballot will be counted if the problem is solved within 3 days of the election. There are 3 reasons for voting with a provisional ballot. That could be that you're unable to show the required photo that you need to vote in person, or when you first registered to vote or registered by mail, you didn't provide valid identification at the time. And the 3rd reason is that your name just simply doesn't appear on the list at your polling precinct. If you vote a provisional ballot because you didn't have acceptable identification, you can go to your county registrar's office, which is the Board of Elections in Macon. It's located right on Pinona, and you can just show them your valid identification. If you voted a provisional ballot because your name did not appear on the list of registered voters in that precinct, you can also go to your registrar and show your ID. However, if you were not eligible to vote in the election, they will let you know and you'll be notified in writing. And if you were at the wrong precincts, only the votes that count if you had voted at the correct precincts will count on your provisional ballot. So you have 3 days to show up to your county registrar's office and give them notice of your identification if you weren't able to provide it at your polling place or your name just wasn't on the list. Something interesting about provisional ballots that I thought was important to include here, if your county keeps gets a court order to keep open the polling places or your precincts past 7:00 p.m., you may still vote with a provisional ballot, but the court order must stand and then your vote will be counted. So that is the summation of provisional ballots. Just you need to make sure that you show up at your county registrar's office with the proper identification or to solve whatever problem it is that came up while you were trying to vote on election day. Here are some important 2020 election dates to remember. You and your family members still have a little bit of time until October the 5th to register yourself to vote. After that deadline, you won't be able to vote in the November elections. And in previous presentations from Ann, you already heard, if you have somebody that you'd like to assist in registering them to vote, I don't know what the communication is like for your loved ones that may be in jail and not have federal offenses, but I do think it would be worth your while to try to attempt to get them registered to vote before October the 5th. October the 12th is the first day of early voting for the November election. So that means from October the 12th until the end of early voting, you'll be able to go to your designated places. In Macon-Bibb County, they have a couple extra ones this time that you can visit to vote early. On October 24th is the mandatory Saturday voting in the state of Georgia for the November election and the special election. More important dates, October 30th, that is the last day of early voting for the November 3rd election, and the deadline to request an absentee ballot for the October 3rd general election and special election. On November 3rd, that's the day we're all anticipating. That's going to be the general election and special election, and absentee ballots must be received by 7 p.m. I appreciate you allowing me to present on provisional ballots and important election days. Tamika, did you have any questions for me as far as it relates to provisional ballots?
I think you covered everything. I want to ask your personal opinion. We have early voting set up from October 12th through October the 30th. Would you recommend folks take advantage of that early voting, or should we all just wait and show up on November the 3rd?
In my opinion, I always recommend that people go in and early vote. You can go ahead and get those numbers counted. You can go ahead and feel good. You can encourage people. You can share that you've voted already on your social media forums or with your family. It gives an opportunity for people to see it over and over and over again, how important it is to vote. Usually I choose to early vote because the lines are short and tons of people are out there excited. It gets you re-energized. It galvanizes the troops. I mean, people are really out there having full parties to celebrate our right to vote and choose our futures and choose the people that will choose our futures. And it's just so important. On election day, I always post a video and I say, oh my gosh, this is my favorite time of the year. It doesn't matter if I vote early or on election day. I never feel more fulfilled than I do when I go vote, because I get to have a choice in who represents me, and I get to have a choice in the laws that are votable. And so I just think that if people want to early vote, they should. They can also organize their friends to go vote, and that usually works out better because on election day, people usually have to work and won't be available at the same time.
That's great. I'd like to invite our other presenters to join us as well, and you can chime in. My personal opinion is very similar to Amber's. Go vote early. Go vote early. Go vote early. You never know what may come up on election day. No one wants to stand in line for hours if you don't have to. And we have the opportunity to be able to vote from October 12th through October 30th. So I would definitely encourage you to do that. Anyone else want to chime in on maybe something that you thought about since your presentation was over, either Ann or Billy or Amber? Would you like to chime in? Anything else that you think our viewers might find important in this conversation?
Yeah, I would like to chime in really quickly and say a word. I know that part of what I wanted to talk about was the organizing around how it is we create change for one of the groups Ann was talking about, and those are those with felony records around voting and the restoration of voting rights. I think it's really important that we understand that a lot of our elections statewide are won by close margins. These are close margins. Our last governor's election in 2018 was decided by less than 50,000 votes. Now, there was a lot of questions about the votes that were not counted, which were much more than that, not to mention those individuals who many of us believe were purged unjustly from the voting records, and a whole nother conversation. But by the votes that were counted, 50,000 votes, that's it. And a lot of our mayoral races, right? Very important. These seats are decided by even less, 800 votes, 50 votes in many cases. So when elections are that close, every individual who is disenfranchised from voting in our state matters. So when you talk about 200,000 plus individuals who have felony records who cannot vote based upon our current laws, that matters. That matters. And so it's very important that we have community conversations really quickly around how it is that people hear the stories of people who've been disenfranchised. And secondly, that if you are a person who has a felony record, we want to hear your story about what your experience has been with voting, because that helps us to get good research and understand how the system can work better. And lastly, I'll say there's a lot of legislation that gets put forth, like Senator Harold Jones put forth some legislation around how it is we better define those who's are excluded. For instance, if all felonies at this point are defined as crimes of moral turpitude, which means that you lose your right to vote. But we think that that should be defined, that everything should not fall under that category. Non-violent offenses, most certainly, like drug-related things, we don't believe should fall under crimes of moral turpitude. And so there's legislation that's being put forth, and we hope that people will keep track of that and support those efforts when they come up so that we can create legislative change.
Thank you.
Tamika, I want to echo him in some sentiments and say, in this current climate that we're living in, where we're not in control of so much, it's so important to get out and vote, because that's something that we can control. We can't control other people's actions, biases, racism, disrespect. We can't control COVID-19, clearly, and we can't control elected officials. But what we can do is take our own opinions to the poll and get people in office that we can trust to do the right thing, that are going to do the best thing for the greater good, that's going to be the best option for our country, because this is a trying time, and this is going to determine the climate of our country for so long, this election will. And I just think it's very important that at the end of the day, no matter what happens, we put our best foot forward, and we've let our voices be heard, and we've taken every option that we can to make sure that our lives are the quality of life that we want for ourselves and our children and our future children. And that's why I think it's very important, if you get to the precinct and you cannot vote, that provisional ballot will be counted. And I think sometimes people lose hope when they have hiccups or bumps in the road. And a bump in the road is not a no, it's just a bump in the road. And so I just want to encourage people to stay steadfast and strong. And if you have friends that are naysayers about voting, this is the time to convince them that their vote counts and their voice matters, and that every vote is equal and everybody does have a voice. And I'm very passionate about encouraging others to make sure that not only themselves, but the people around them do what's best for our entire community.
Thank you, Amber. Anne, any closing words from you? Parting statements?
I'll just say amen to what Billy and Amber said, because they were great, and I appreciated everything that they said and learned from them, and they were right on.
Well, we thank our panelists so much, and I would like to now turn it over to Ms. Sylvia McGee.
Oh, thank you, Tamika. And thank you for joining us. And I'd like to certainly express our appreciation to the panel for providing us with this very important information, and how much I gained from listening to the discussion. And we hope too that the audience have gained useful information that will either help them directly or help someone that they know. So in summary, I'd like to say we must constantly be reminded that if we are to have a lasting voice, we must take the time to learn about important issues and to hold elected officials accountable. In the 2016 election, 100 million people who were eligible did not vote. We must understand, and I think the panel said this over and over, that voting determines whether some citizens have health care or not, Voting determines whether you have a decent wage to live on or not. Voting will determine whether you will have another stimulus package in this COVID era or not. Voting impacts important programs like Head Start, and the list can go on. And I would just kind of want to summarize something I heard Bishop Barber say on a town hall the other night, that our ancestors lost jobs fighting for the right to vote. Our ancestors lost land fighting for the right to vote. Our ancestors lost limbs and their lives fighting for the right to vote. So don't let their actions and their sacrifices be in vain. Vote. It's your voice and your power. Again, thank you, panel, for doing an incredible job, for providing us great information. And we want to again to say that your voice is your vote and it's your power. Use it. Thank you for joining us, and good evening to all.